you want me on the stage or walk up?
I'd like you on the stage, Mike.
Good evening. My name is Hollis Towns, Executive Editor and Vice President for News for the Asbury Park Press and the Regional Editor for USA Today Network New Jersey. I want to welcome you tonight to our conversation about marijuana. We've put together a fantastic panel of individuals who are going to talk to you about the issues. But before we go there, I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about the USA Today Network New Jersey. We are the largest news gathering operation in the state, with operations from Mahwah to Maysville. So before I go any further, I'd like for you to watch a short video. Then my colleague, Dan Sforza, will come up and talk more about the program tonight. Thank you and welcome.
The USA Today Network New Jersey is your home for the news you can use in the Garden State. From police and fire to sports and weather.
This is a big-time rivalry game.
From dining and entertainment to award-winning investigations, we're your one-stop shop for photos, videos, and the breaking news coverage you need.
MS-13's presence in the Garden State.
Powered by USA Today newsrooms in North Jersey, South Jersey, Central Jersey, and the Jersey Shore.
The police never found the killers.
Whether they're on the ground, on the road, or in the air, USA Today Network New Jersey journalists are there, covering the issues that impact you, your family, and your community.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Sforza. I'm the editor of the Bergen Record and NorthJersey.com. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight to come out and learn a little bit about marijuana. We've dedicated a lot of coverage to it over the last year, and it's a testament to how important we believe the issue is. Your presence here is a testament to how important you believe the issue is. It affects communities, it affects businesses, it affects parents, school children, and it affects us in a very uniquely local way. And we recognize that, and that's why we've dedicated as a network 2 full-time reporters to covering the issue. We even took the step of sending them out to Colorado and California earlier this year to take a look at how legalized recreational marijuana affected those communities in those states. And we took a look at it from a business perspective, we took a look at it from a personal perspective, from a law enforcement perspective, to get a sense of what it might look like in New Jersey. I'm pleased tonight that we have both of those reporters here, James Nash from The Record and Mike Davis from the Asbury Park Press. Mike is going to lead our program. I'll introduce him now and let it get underway. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. So, like you said, my name is Mike Davis. I am one of those aforementioned reporters. I've been covering marijuana basically full-time for the better part of a year. And it is a very interesting topic to cover, as you can imagine, in this day and age. So I'm going to give you an idea what you kind of expect tonight. So we were trying, like Dan said, there's a lot of conversations happening throughout the state about marijuana right now, whether it's in police stations, in Trenton, at kitchen tables. And we were trying to figure out a way that we could all come together and talk about marijuana. And we put our writer brains together, and we came up with the name, Let's Talk About Marijuana. We're super creative, no journalism required at all. Let's talk about marijuana. So this is not a debate. I mean, we have people here, very knowledgeable panelists from all sides of this argument. We're here to have a conversation. We're here to talk about it. So we're going to talk about it up on the stage for a little while. We're going to then go to the audience. If you have any questions, I'll come out to you with this microphone. Just a couple things. We are all grown-ups in this room. Please be respectful. You can swear up and down that the person on stage might be saying something you don't agree with or you don't believe. Be respectful, that's all I ask. And also, if you can tell with all the cameras, we are going out live on Facebook Live, on YouTube. So keep it PG-13. Don't start cursing anybody off. Also, don't be surprised when you wind up on camera. Tell your friends, please, when you're in the audience, feel free, share the link around so people know to what's going on here tonight. So, without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. First up, we have retired from 25 years in the state police. Please welcome Nick Bucci, everybody.
Thank you.
The executive director of the ACLU in New Jersey, Amol Sinha. Over on the far right, we have the police chief in Sayreville Township, my next-door neighbor where I live, and he's the vice president of the New Jersey Association of Chiefs of Police, John Zabrowski. And finally, we have the senior pastor at Paradise Baptist Church in Newark. Please welcome Jethro James, everybody, Bishop James. And in the middle, my colleague, the person who hears from me way too much nowadays, at the Bergen Record at the USA Today Network, New Jersey. Please welcome James Nash. So James, we're going to go to you first. Give me an idea. There was a lot of talk about October 29th, that this was the day New Jersey was going to legalize weed. It's not going to happen, I think, but give me an idea where we are legislatively.
Sure, and I guess I'll rewind a little bit for those who haven't been following this issue closely. New Jersey would be only the second state in the country to legalize marijuana through legislation. The other states, and I believe there are 9 now that have recreational or adult use marijuana, have all done so through the ballot, with the exception of Vermont, which has kind of a strange system. They actually do not have stores that sell marijuana, but you can grow your own, and there's personal use that's legal. So New Jersey, although it would not be the first state to do legal marijuana, it would be one of the first, if not the first, really, to establish a full marketplace through legislation. So that's created a little more complication around the issue. There are 4 states that are voting on marijuana initiatives in less than 2 weeks on the November ballot. 2 of those are recreational, the other 2 are medical. So New Jersey may well lose its place in line a little bit. So in terms of the legislation here, the Senate President, Steve Sweeney, who's in favor of legalization, had set an October 29th deadline for a vote. It's probably not going to happen. Even he and his counterpart in the State Assembly acknowledge that it could be weeks, if not months, before we get to a vote. So that's, of course, the challenge of doing something legislatively. When it's on the ballot, it has to be voted on by date certain. When it's in the legislature, it can just drag on and on and on, and it has. The governor was elected just about a year ago exactly on the promise of legalization, among other things, of course. And he's sort of been a little bit on the sidelines since he took office. It's gone through the legislature, and the legislature has other priorities. So we're probably looking at late this year, possibly dragging into next year.
I think it's safe to say, if anybody's ever paid attention to state government in New Jersey, when Governor Murphy said he wanted to legalize marijuana by the end of the year, I think we all looked at him and said, yeah, okay, we'll see how that plays out. But there's been a lot of talk, and we're gonna get into a lot of the details. But briefly, Amal, I mean, the ACLU's been on record saying if the legislation that's there right now were to pass, there are things missing. Give me an idea, sort of, those big sticking points right now.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. Usually, I'm loath to be on a panel that is all male, but I am happy to be in good company here. There are several priorities that the ACLU has been advocating for a long time. We're a part of a coalition called New Jersey United for Marijuana Reform that formed in 2014, and since then we've been advocating for 4 main principles. One is automatic expungements of people's records. People that have marijuana convictions and arrests on their records should see those arrests and convictions be expunged from those records. The second is community reinvestment. We want to make sure that tax revenue, and it's potentially substantial tax revenue from an industry that's legalized, goes to social justice and social service causes in those communities that have been hardest hit by the war on drugs. The third is a diverse industry. We want to see an equity program that creates opportunities for people, not just millionaires, not just corporations, but people who live in New Jersey. We want to make sure that the industry is as diverse as New Jersey is. And the last is home grow. We want to see limited amounts of home grow available to people for personal use, because there are people who are economically limited and people who are limited in mobility. And all of these things are part of a package that we want to see in legislation. And I have to say, the drafts that we've seen so far, they are largely insufficient on all 4 fronts. And we want to make sure that we push as hard as we can to get those things in, because If we don't think about racial justice and social justice when we think about legalization, we're doing a true disservice, and we're going to be perpetuating injustice as a result. It's really important to do whatever we can to eliminate the harms wrought on communities throughout the state from the war on drugs and the prohibition of marijuana.
Bishop James, Chief Zabrowski, I mean, you've both been on record, both personally and for organizations you represent, against legalization. I wonder if you can kind of give the people an idea of maybe the key weaknesses here outside of legalization itself.
There's a couple of things that can be done. Legalization, in my mind, is not an option. We're not against the medical marijuana because those that need it and it's prescribed correctly, that's fine. We're not even against decriminalization, which they already have in certain states. You have X amount of marijuana, and you're allowed to smoke it in areas where you're allowed to smoke it. The problem that we've even seen with that, especially in neighborhoods of color, is the reality that you get a ticket if you're smoking it in the wrong place, and like a traffic ticket, if you don't pay it, there's a warrant. But my real problem with total legalization of marijuana is this. In the African American community, where are you going to work? If in communities of color, if the national unemployment is 4 or 5%, it's 8 to 15%. Those are reality numbers. I heard my colleague from the ACLU, and we do agree with some of the things that they do stand for, social justice, but there's nothing in any bill that says we're going to expunge anything or let anyone out. The other thing is that it's really a health issue. New Jersey in the lower 48 leads the nation. We're #1 in the nation as far as low birth rate and early births of African American and Hispanic babies. We know that this number is only going to go up. And so the reality is total legalization is a forest for us. And in addition, right now, including the governor's own municipality, 60 municipalities have already joined in NIMBY, not in my backyard. And so it would force another problem on the African American and Hispanic community, with the only gain being we would be larger in the unemployment pieces. You're never going to work for PSE&G, and I'm a retired urban development executive. I'm currently a chaplain with the New Jersey State Police, did ground zero and all of that, survived the cancer. You're never going to be in law enforcement. You'll never drive a bus or train. You will never work for any major construction corporation or any other corporation. And so even the employment piece will devastate our community because it only will be more unemployment.
You know, I do think that's something interesting that's been lost in this, is that there's sort of, and what we're talking about is straight up, should marijuana be legalized? That's the question. That's been the question for a number of years. And there's sort of like this black and white idea that like either you're for it or against it. And both you, Chief Zabrowski, and Bishop James, you're involved with New Jersey Responsible Approaches for Marijuana, which is this organization that is not about no marijuana whatsoever. It's about what they say smart approaches, which is not legalization. Amal, I want to throw it to you, Nick. Is decriminalization enough? I mean, Bishop James offered that, but that's been seen as one step, maybe a first step. Is there room to go from there?
Well, with decriminalization, what you're going to wind up doing is you're not going to take the drugs out of the hands of the street corner dealer. It's only going to enhance him even more to sell that drug on the street corner. When you decriminalize it, he's going to be out there selling his wares on that street corner, and the people buying from him are not going to know what's in that product, what he has mixed it with. I know from experience of 25 years in the state police, 22 of those years in narcotics, worked the streets. I worked the streets in Asbury Park years ago undercover, and I know some of the marijuana we were purchasing then when it went through the lab, it was laced with formaldehyde. It was laced with opium to sell on a street corner. And my question to that is, who would you rather have controlling and regulating this thing, the government or the street dealer? So decriminalization, I think should be off the table. We go for full legalization.
And Chief Zabrowski, I mean, I think you're a chief of a town it's very New Jersey. I mean, it's a decent number, a decent population. It's a small town feel to it. I mean, give me your thoughts.
Well, first of all, I think there is a big difference between legalization and decriminalization. And the State Chiefs Association is in support of decriminalization because let's face it, the drug is not benign, okay? There are issues. And if we just legalize the drug, we're pretty much allowing our children to say it's okay to use. And it's not okay to use. There are health consequences. There are so many other different negative effects that can happen to our youth, our teens, and also our adults that we're aware of. And there are concrete issues that our clinicians, our physicians have all been able to show us already. So I think there is a difference. And I think with decriminalization, I think you take some of the issues that Amal was talking about, and I think we can create a better criminal justice system. And isn't that what we really want to do? Just recently, we had an overhaul of bail reform. And there were a lot of people that said that that could never happen. But I'm going to tell you it did. And I can see in this particular issue that we can solve some of those issues that Amal is talking about through a criminal justice reform as opposed to the legalization of recreational marijuana.
And I guess if I can throw in a little bit here from Mike and I were both in states that have full legalization, Colorado and California. There are different models out there. Decriminalization, just to be clear, it means that you would legally be able to consume the drug, but you can't legally buy it. So that creates a little bit of a dilemma because you can't just walk into a store and buy leaves or anything like that. So you're still buying it from dealers, but you can use it in the privacy of your own home with no risk of being arrested. As I mentioned earlier, Vermont has a sort of a hybrid system where you can grow your own and you can consume it, but you can't go to the store and buy it. In all likelihood, the direction that policymakers are moving here is the network of dispensaries around the state. One interesting aspect of the current or the most recent draft of the bill, there's no limit to the number of stores in that bill. An earlier version envisioned about 200, and I went on the Taco Bell website, not that I'm endorsing them, but it's roughly the same number of Taco Bell stores in New Jersey. So if you think of a Taco Bell, your nearest Taco Bell, chances are there'd be a dispensary, for every Taco Bell out there. But the current version of the bill does not have a limit in it at all. That would be left to a regulatory commission. And I guess maybe the panelists can talk about that a little bit. How do you see this landscape potentially building out? Do you see it as being a huge, on every street corner kind of scenario for good or bad?
Yeah, Amali, I'm sorry, Bishop James, yeah, please.
Well, one of the things we've already know that 60 municipalities where people that look like me don't live, or there's only one or two, have already said we're not going to sell it. And so it forces it back into the urban areas. Now, it was said by one of the colleagues here that the reality is that full legalization would be devastating because the way the bill is written right now, number one, it says you can apply for expungement. Well, if bin Laden was around, he still could apply for expungement. So that's ridiculous rhetoric. What we've seen in states like Colorado, because we use them as the model because they're one of the first states, is that now, because it's all cash, you can't come in with a credit card, you can't come in with anything else. We're seeing cartels from Cuba, cartels from Mexico, because now it's a money laundering business. We've seen the street stuff, and we're looking at this from law enforcement standpoint today. The street dealer is going crazy because if you have a legitimate business, you paid for a license, and your package is ABC, all I have to do is duplicate your package sells, and we'll use $10 for your package. I put ABD and put my same stuff because there is a lot of bad stuff in the street out there, and I sell it for $5.
Bishop James, obviously, you're talking about public safety, and public safety is probably the number one sort of concern that gets brought up. Chief Zabrowski, give me an idea of your concerns as a law enforcement officer. Driving has got to be the first thing, I would imagine.
Well, I'm very concerned. You talked about my town, and my town is one of those where it's kind of that crossroads of the highways from the Parkway, the Turnpike, Route 9, Route 18. on any given day, there's 400,000 cars that travel through my town. So I've seen an awful lot when it comes to drunk driving or impaired driving. And I am concerned by that issue specifically because there is no identifiable quantitative or qualitative way of proving impairment at this point for drugged drivers. It is a much different equation and evaluation from what we do now for alcohol. And my concern is we're kind of putting the cart before the horse. I think we should have that in place before we do anything. And none of the states really have a identifiable and a concrete way in which to judge impairment at this point.
One of the reasons I love this panel is we have 2 police officers on the panel. Nick, I mean, you're on a different side of the issue. I mean, that's obviously a concern, but I mean, I would love to hear your thoughts on whether that's enough to nip it in the bud.
I don't think it is. You know, I spent a number of years on the road as a road trooper, and in the 4 years that I was in uniform, I did not make not one arrest for marijuana usage on the highway. Made many arrests for drunk drivers all the time. I did, in fact, make arrests for possession of marijuana in the vehicle. Because as I always say, where there's smoke, there's fire. If I stopped the car, I suspected the guy was under the influence, I'd start talking to him. My nose would tell me I smelled some marijuana. I carried a little bit further. Next thing you know, I'm searching the interior of the car around that driver, and I find so much as a little joint, a little roach, as they used to call it. There's my arrest. I made my arrest. He's under arrest. If I want to carry it further to find out if he was under the influence, I could. But normally I wouldn't do that. It would be for a possession charge and a possession charge only. So.
And I'm sorry, and you know, us at the network, we've done a lot of research about the number of arrests are really skyrocketing over the years. And it comes during a period where, you know, every polling data comes out says that legalization's a little bit of a, you know, it's growing in popularity to say the least. I want to talk about racial disparities because I think social justice is one of the main things, one of the main sticking points, as Amal said earlier. Amal, I mean, everybody's getting pulled over, that's a fact. Talk to me about the racial disparities involved, because the ACLU has done tremendous research on this.
So, yeah, thank you. We know for a fact that there are racial disparities in marijuana enforcement. In New Jersey, you're 3 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession if you're black than if you're white. And we know for a fact from federal data that black communities and white communities use marijuana at similar rates. We know for a fact that nationally, you're 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession if you're black than if you're white. In New Jersey, in certain communities, we know that you're exponentially more likely to be arrested if you're black than if you're white, 18 to 31 times more likely. And it's incredibly important that we think about this in the context of our prison population as well. New Jersey has the worst racial disparity in its prisons in the country. The black folks are 12 times more likely to be incarcerated for any crime in New Jersey than white folks. And I think it's incredibly important for the legislature and for the governor's office to keep that in mind every step of the way when they are going about legalization, because we need protections in that bill to make sure that we don't perpetuate the same injustices. And a lot of this is about law enforcement culture, right? It's more than just about legalizing. We don't see legalization as a panacea that's going to fix all of our injustices in the world. There is racism in the world. There's implicit and explicit bias in the world. And it's really important that, you know, we don't view legalization as the cure-all for that. You know, the ACLU is committed to seeing this through, and that means implementation with public education, with training for law enforcement, with training for the public. We want to make sure that law enforcement knows that it's not okay for people to be arrested for other crimes, marijuana-related crimes that may still be illegal or not contemplated in a bill with the same racial disparities that we're seeing in marijuana possession enforcement. So.
Yeah, I want to throw to James. I mean, James had a unique experience as part of our High Hopes project. He was in California. You did a ride-along with CHIPS, with the California Highway Patrol, with a drug enforcement officer. I mean, give me an idea what's that like. I mean, they're sort of in a weird spot because they're in this first year since legalization, but I'd love to hear sort of how that went.
Sure. Just by way of background, I think roughly 2 to 3% of police in both California and New Jersey have this specialized training as drug recognition officers, which means they go beyond just doing breathalyzers. They're able to recognize some of the other signs of intoxication, both alcohol and other drugs. A lot of what they find are opioids and even prescription medications, but in California, they've undergone training specific to marijuana, and so there are signs of intoxication that are different from that of alcohol. But that said, I did spend about 9-10 hours, I believe, with one of the California Highway Patrol officers in Los Angeles overnight on a Saturday night when you would expect to find a lot of intoxicated people, and the traditional drunk driving arrests outnumbered the drugged driving arrests like 5-1, which is to say there were 5 drunk drivers and 1 marijuana driver. So not a whole lot in either area, and they will admit it's still hard for them to do marijuana enforcement because of what Chief Zabrowski mentioned earlier. There are telltale signs of intoxication, and you can still make an arrest absolutely for, without a definitive breathalyzer test or a definitive blood test, but the bar is set a little bit higher because a lot of police are used to being able to have someone blow into a tube, and then that's their prima facie. Whereas if you have someone who's just weaving in and out of traffic, you may try to charge them with something else beyond intoxication. You can take them in, and I believe you can compel a blood test. But again, with marijuana, the signs of THC in your bloodstream, they'll linger for days, if not weeks. And that's even if you're not showing any sign of intoxication, it's still there in your blood, which makes it harder to test like the intoxication there and then, because the alcohol will clear out of your system in a few hours. Not so with marijuana.
Yeah, Chief Zabrowski, I mean, you got to deal with this all the time, I'm sure, on the Parkway, on Route 9. I mean, these are all areas right in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, but it's actually not completely true what Jim was saying as far as the dissipation or the metabolization of the THC in someone's system. One of the problems that we run into right now is if we're going to do a blood test, you actually have to get a warrant from a judge in order to do that. The problem being is that it metabolizes into your fatty tissues quicker. So it may not be the THC level that you anticipate having by the time there is an accident or an arrest that's taken and the warrant is issued and actually the blood is drawn. So it still becomes a very difficult process for us to be able to do. The second issue is because it is a less technical opportunity at this point to measure blood alcohol as opposed to impairment for drugs. I think most times the officers don't go through that next step because they don't need to prove that. They've proven already one violation or one prohibited act by being impaired by alcohol. So I would tell you that in most cases, there's probably a larger or higher level of impairment. It's just not being checked on at this point.
Please.
We talked about racial disparity. What we've seen in states, and just recently, I was in Baltimore last week. The Beltway now allows it to be sold. We're seeing I call them the food truck marijuana trucks. They pull around the corner from a large venue, especially in the African-American community, from a church. They sell the edibles, by the way, which is marketed to our children. Pop-Tarts, Gumby Bears, lollipops, sodas, ice cream. We're seeing an increase in juvenile arrests for possession. Now understand, this doesn't say you're high, but you still need, if they pass full legalization, you have to be 21 to possess it. We're seeing a 78% increase in juveniles with possession charges. So now you're lost to start with because you're still not 21. They're going to sell it to you. The other thing, racial disparity, what we've seen in Denver and in Colorado is that for anyone that has a child that smokes, the reality is that we're seeing children from 0 to 8 going to pediatrician clinics as well as hospitals because of the THC poisoning. There is no EpiPen for THC. What else are we seeing in as far as racial disparities? We know in New Jersey, just a few years ago, we had maybe 1 or 2 automobile insurances. They've already said that they've talked to some of us and said at the 1,000-foot level, they're going to ask for 20% increase in insurance rates on your automobile. And we know in New Jersey, depending on what your zip code is, for example, the Central Ward of Newark is 07103. Your car rates are going to go through the roof. We're not having that conversation.
So regarding the youth arrest rates, that's what I referred to previously as a law enforcement culture issue, right? When law enforcement no longer has the ability to arrest people for possession, simple possession, adult possession, they turn to other things to look for. And youth arrests is a pretty straightforward, easy thing to do. And that's why we need a cultural shift and a narrative shift alongside this. And we need training to make sure that law enforcement resources aren't going to things that are easy to pick up, yet have devastating impact for the community. Now, I can't vouch for the statistics that the bishop just said, but I'm sure that there has been an increase in youth arrest rates. But I think that's something that we can preempt in New Jersey by the right sorts of training, the right sorts of education for both the youth and the police officers. And it's stuff that I don't think it's sufficient to use that as a reason why we shouldn't go forward with legalization.
So as you can see, there's a lot of different viewpoints. I mean, one of the things I like with covering the story, I think James has said the same thing too, is like you could have people that vehemently disagree with each other on a very core level, but there's still something involved. I mean, we're still talking about social justice issues that everybody's concerned with. So we're going to take it to the crowd now. I'm going to start off. Please, FYI, just give me your hands. I'll come to you. You can ask a question of me, my colleague James, any of the panelists up here. We are going to start with my colleague at the Asbury Park Press, our opinion editor, Randy Bergman. Randy, I mean, what do you think about what you're hearing, concerns you might have, anything about the people on stage?
Well, I think it's been a very good conversation. I would say, and of course our position editorially has been to oppose recreational marijuana use. I've written a couple of columns myself on it opposing it. There's nothing I've heard here tonight that's really changed my mind. We've been opposed to it primarily for three reasons. One has been the opposition from the State Association of Police Chiefs, and I think their concerns about safety are very legitimate. We're also concerned about the health effects, which really haven't been touched upon much tonight, but I think those are very important concerns. We're also have also been opposed to it because of the opposition from some of the black leaders in the state. And many of them feel that it's going to be a bad thing for their communities. And I think that's a very logical and convincing argument. The other reason personally that I'm opposed to it is we are in the midst of an opioid crisis. I have a teenage son and two tweeners. I won't talk about my own marijuana use back when I was in college, although I will say I never inhaled. However, I think the opioid crisis is really severe. My kids are constantly exposed to a barrage of information about how bad drug use is for you. And to me, to legalize marijuana sends a real bad message and certainly a contradictory message. So, obviously this is not an all black or white issue, but again, I think our position is that the cons outweigh the pros.
Sure. I mean, I think when we talk about the opioid crisis, that's a very important thing. I mean, you're even talking about medical marijuana now. The state's looking at opioid use as a qualifying condition that you can get your card for that. I want to start, Nick. I mean, you worked in drug enforcement for most of your career. That's right. I mean, I'd love to hear sort of your take. I mean, you watched the opioid crisis start from the crack epidemic to the opioid crisis. I mean, what do you make of all this? I mean, I would love to kind of see how you wind up on this point of view.
Well, first, let me say this. 50 years now I've been involved with this war on drugs. 50 years, 25 as a state trooper, another 25 behind the lines. And I can tell you, this war on drugs has been an abject failure. And anybody tells you anything different, they better see a psychiatrist. The other thing is, in my whole career, toward the end of my career, we had a raid go down, and a man was shot dead for possession of 5 pounds of marijuana. It was at that time I decided that was it, I was done. I had my 25 in, put my papers in, and left. I lost 2 partners during this drug war, one in a shootout, and another after a long night of surveillance, driving home, ran off the road and hit a tree. We look at it, I look at the problem now, and it hasn't changed. Drugs are cheaper today than they were back then. They're more available than they were back then. We arrest an average of 25,000 young people every year just for marijuana possession charges. And we do that every year. So we have to change course. And the way to do that is through legalization.
Thank you so much, Nick. We have a question over here, ma'am. What's your name?
Susan Gardner.
Susan.
I had a horrible operation about 6 years ago, and they gave me opioids, and I never took one. Never. I'd rather die than take them because I didn't want to become addicted. But I was in terrible pain. I still am. I have all rods going from my neck all the way down my back. I went to Colorado with my grandsons, and they got me gummy bears. All right. And I was able to enjoy a wedding. Then I went to California, and I went in and I got some, what is it, CVDs or something, and I brought home a pen, and we went to Europe, and my girl said, "You're not going to Europe," and I said, "I'll stash it away." But we walked all through Europe, and as soon as I felt a little pain, I took a little puff, and I went to Amsterdam, never bought it there. I had my little pen with me, and I came home, and I had a wonderful trip. I believe in it. It's a safe way, and I'm not addicted. If I take a puff once in a while when I can't sleep, I think it's wonderful. All right, it's not becoming addicted. It's an easy way. It's not drugs all the time. It's just, and it's not marijuana. And I don't even think anything's wrong with marijuana. It's not opioids.
Yeah. Bishop James, how's this playing out in your community? I mean, you deal with obviously a different situation than what we might see here.
As I said, a chaplain with the state police at.
One of these stores, you can't just go in and buy it. You have to sign in. All right, you have to be 21. You have to give them some kind of ID.
But that's
They're
medical.
Not
You
letting
have that
anybody
now.
in.
You have medical now. We're not
It's
opposing
not
medical.
It's any type of marijuana. You have to sign in. You have to give them your ID. You can't just walk in.
If you come and go with Denver to a couple of places I've been, you can. And so and depending on your economic situation, but we're not fighting medical. We're not fighting medical at all. I think you ought to have the right. I'm a cancer survivor. I think you ought to have the right to have medical. And you're over 21, and so you can make a conscientious decision. What I'm seeing in my community is that children are getting marijuana. Children. I sit on the board of St. Michael's Hospital. I see 25 to 30 kids almost every other day that are out of their mind from bad stuff. We're not even talking about, in the state of New Jersey, there is no legislation talking about how much THC. There is no legislation talking about how do you open the place up, and there's no legislation. The devil is in the details. If we do it right, maybe in a year or two, and that's fine, but medical you already have. And so why do you need to fully legalize something that's going to take out probably your grandchildren? Now, I'm in law enforcement. I've done 18 years in the state police and still there. And so the reality is we are the home, and it was my organization that was part of the lawsuit. We're the home of racial profiling. And the reality is you're going to put it back in my community. Right now, as I pointed out, 60 municipalities where folks that don't look like me live, including the governors, have said not in my backyard.
All right, we have a question here from Brian. Brian.
Hi, my name's Brian. First of all, I'll just point out that, I worked in schools for 15 years. I was an educator. I was a school administrator for 9 years and a teacher for 6. I used cannabis regularly, pretty heavily, and I've been hugely successful in my career. I have 3 college degrees, one of which I just finished last year. I'm on my way to get my doctorate, which I just got my ed specialist instead. But anyway, You know, 60 towns are against cannabis, but that to me means 450 towns haven't weighed in yet. Atlantic City, Trenton, Jersey City, Asbury Park are all for cannabis coming on board. I think it would revitalize the state's economy. I mean, there's empty buildings and infrastructure everywhere. I live up in northern Monmouth County. I mean, there's buildings all over the place that are vacant. We could bring in businesses everywhere. And I think over time, don't you think that they will adjust the regulations, especially as cannabis comes more into the mainstream, and maybe won't drug test for cannabis, just like, you know, they don't drug test for coffee or fast food, which is much more unhealthy for you?
Is that addressed to me?
I think that's very interesting. Amal, the ACLU's done a lot of work when it comes to getting people involved in the industry and obviously removing some of those barriers, considering.
Well, there's a public safety issue. Just imagine, as I said, I did 38 years at PSE&G. Just imagine someone coming in and putting in a gas main or a high voltage electricity through your home. We've already talked to several unions as well as those that take care of, and you mentioned you work in the education system. If you were drug tested, you'd been in the rubber room. That's a fact. You can't work there and be high. And I went to school when it was much harder, have a doctorate and all that right now. The reality is, it's fine. The other piece, and I want to point out, if you live in public housing, because it's still federally illegal, you will be evicted. If you live in public housing, if your child comes to a daycare center in the state of New Jersey and their clothes reek with the smell of marijuana, legally or not, you'll have a DIFUS case. These are facts. They're not putting any of that in the background of legislation. And so when we look at the ACLU, you don't let a bull out of the shop and then say, well, let's catch it because it broke everything up. You fix the bull first, and then you let him go once you've done what you need to do to make sure that he doesn't tear up everything.
Yeah, Brian mentioned drug testing. I think that's a topic that gets lost in the shuffle a lot because it's something that a lot of people have to go through. I mean, if you're going to qualify for a job, this is an issue. I wonder if somebody on stage can talk about that. I mean, Amal, maybe. I mean, this has got to be something the ACLU is thinking about, isn't it?
Right, it is. And look, private employer rights are unique in the state and in the country. If a private employer thinks that you are unfit to perform the job that you are assigned, they have the right to fire you. They have the right to say, you know, you can't work here anymore. If they do that because you are drunk, if they do that because you are high, if they do that because you're on prescription medication that's putting you to sleep, they can do that. And it's all legit. It's all perfectly fine. We're not taking that right away from private employers. Now, what we can do, though, is reduce the stigma around marijuana. And that comes with legalization and public education for employers and for anybody else in this community. We need to make sure that if people are going to be consuming, that the stigma around it is less so that people can consume safely and they don't have to be in fear of their job every step of the way. Now, if you're operating heavy machinery or if you're a police officer, maybe you are going to think twice before you consume marijuana. And if you're in an industry that has to deal with weapons or heavy machinery, maybe that industry will think twice before hiring you. And that's fine. That's something that's always been the case for any industry, for any drug, for any substance. And that's not something that's going to change.
I'm going to take a question here from Brandon, who's from right here in Asbury Park. Brandon.
Yes, hello. Thank you guys for coming out and having this panel of discussion. Thank you very much. My name is Brandon Chewy. I live blocks from here. This is a very large topic to me. I'm a person in recovery from an 11-year heroin addiction, and it nearly killed me. It killed many people in this city. It killed countless friends of mine, countless friends of ours, and this drug saved my life. That's all I have to say. This drug saved my life. I've been to 24 rehabilitative programs. I've spent 6 years incarcerated in Monmouth County Jail for simple possession crimes. Now, if we don't fully decriminalize this drug, we're looking at a legalization process that is run by our government, essentially. And our government is going to continue to appropriate these dispensaries to the upper 1% that can afford these facilities, like the gentleman said, not in communities that can afford these licenses. So who's going to afford these licenses? People that do not belong in these communities, people that are not from these communities. And I actually commend Mayor Moore of Asbury Park for recently denouncing a local facility in the area because they are not from the community. Now, overall, we need decriminalization. We need home grow. A person like me, I am in recovery out of jail for 5 years now, living as sober as possible, to productive society member as I possibly can be. Off probation, paying my fines. I'm a medical marijuana patient by the state of New Jersey. I have to pay nearly $500 an ounce of marijuana at the dispensaries in New Jersey, when I'm not allowed to home cultivate strains that they don't carry at the dispensaries to suit my personal individual diagnosis. Now, my individual diagnosis, to me, certain strains of medical marijuana work for me. They're not available at these dispensaries. And on top of that, the black market prices are half of that of the dispensaries. So what are people that are in low-income areas going to do? They're going to go to that low-income black market dealer that they can afford, subjecting them to police interaction and more jail. At 18 years old, I went to jail and got a felony on my conviction for my record. For the rest of my life, it's still there. If we don't decriminalize and expunge records, we are inevitably facing problems. And the gentleman before speaking about the economy of New Jersey, it needs to expand. It's just ignorance at this point. The war on drug has failed. Anyone interested in getting involved with the local Asbury Park cannabis community, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.
So a couple things there from Brandon. He mentioned home grow, and we mentioned that briefly, both Amal about the ACLUs talking about home grow, James, how it's kind of a non-starter in this discussion. I want to hear from one of our law enforcement people. How, if there is home grow, I mean, how do you try to enforce that if you're an officer on the street? I mean, Chief Zabrowski, you're there. I mean, you know, Nick, you were on the street for all those years. I mean, how does that play out?
Well, I'm going to tell you that's actually very difficult if there is home grow. But two things. First, I want to congratulate, is it Brandon, for being clean? That is wonderful. It's one of the reasons why the Chiefs Association is not opposed to decriminalization or medical marijuana, because we believe that there is reason for comfort in being empathetic and compassionate for that cause. Secondly, Brian raised an issue which I think we kind of glossed over, and that is time. And he said, we have a lot of it. And maybe that's the issue here, is why are we rushing? And it does appear that we are rushing. Most of the statistics, most of the information that's coming out from these other states so far is still descriptive because it's relatively new. And we can debate what those numbers are at this point, but why can't we wait a little bit so that we can look at this at our own way, not so myopic way, but by looking at how everybody's doing it and taking the time to look at the numbers, to do our own studies and do something comprehensive. I think that was probably the point that we're trying to make more than anything else, is we don't have to rush this process. We could take the time to really dig down and see what this is all about.
Amal, talk to me. I mean, we talked about expungements very briefly, and I think that's a huge piece of this. There might be some people in this audience that are interested. I mean, what is the process to get an expungement now? I mean, because from what I understand, it is not a simple snap of a finger, you get an expungement.
That's right. Right now, in order to get an expungement, you have to file copious amounts of paperwork. You have to serve all of the entities that could have been involved in your arrest and conviction. So that includes, if you were prosecuted in municipal court, you got to go to serve the municipal prosecutor, the municipal court, the municipal police, the state police, which holds a lot of criminal justice information and history, the state administration of the Office of the Courts, the state court system, and the state attorney general's office. And all of these folks have different pieces of information that deal with your case. What we want to see is an expedited or automated process for that. The burden, we think, should be on the state to figure out who's eligible to be expunged and what those records are that are going to be expunged, and then summarily expunging those records. I shouldn't have to pay exorbitant fees, go through the copious amounts of paperwork, hire an attorney. The Administrative Office of the Courts actually recommends that you hire an attorney to deal with an expungement, and that could be an astronomical cost for most people. So it's incredibly important that we figure out expungements as we figure out legalization. And for me, that means the state has the burden of figuring out expungements for the individual, and that the individual either doesn't have to lift a finger or has to lift their pinky finger to be able to get it.
And let me add to that, that folks in poverty definitely can't afford a lawyer. Many of the folks that are in jail for marijuana, to get them through the system, and it wasn't for a joint, you may get arrested for a joint, but they throw that out. You say yes, and that's out. And that's why I'm for decriminalization. The reality is that if you have 5 pounds of marijuana and 4 crack rocks, the crack rocks, and I'm going to what I know in my community, the 4 crack rocks carry more time than the marijuana. And so to get you through the system, they say do 2 to 3 or 2 to 5 on the marijuana, and you'll be out in 18 months, and we'll throw away the crack, which carries 7 to 10. The reality is now to get the expungement, they now bring in the federal piece. You need every piece of information. As my colleague from the ACLU said, that this is an astronomical cost. It's, you know, hurry up and wait for the next guy to give me the next piece of paper for the next $200, $300, $400, $500, $600, $700, $800, $2,000, $3,000. You already owe fines, and I congratulate my brother in the back that talked about what you're getting. The marijuana business, that what we know now, there's only 5 big growers. The other thing is, and again, we agree with the ACLU, they're selling us a pipe dream. There are 99.7% of all growers and manufacturers of marijuana don't look like me because we can't afford it. They're selling this pipe dream. You need $5 million to get really started. Anybody else tell you anything else? They're telling you a fairy tale.
Thank you, Bishop James. I want to throw it to my colleague, Ed Forbes, the opinion editor over at the Bergen Record. Ed, give me an idea what you're hearing tonight, and if you have anything for the panel, please throw it to them.
Sure, and first of all, let me congratulate a fabulous panel and congratulate my colleagues across the USA Today Network New Jersey who've organized this evening. It's been very thoughtful and I think very civil, and in terms of a lot of the public discussion we see today, not only on this issue but on so many more, very refreshing as a result. So up at the Record, we editorialized on September 13th in favor of legalization. Our position on the issue is essentially aligned with the ACLU's, and so we have faced considerable praise and considerable criticism as a result of that editorial. In the aftermath of taking that position, though, I spoke with, and I'm interested in the bishop's perspective on this. I spoke with a cannabis industry leader. This is a young woman who runs an operation called Vangst, which bills itself essentially as the LinkedIn for the cannabis industry. And they are citing some pretty outrageous economic growth numbers across states and now the provinces of Canada where legalization has happened. Something like, you know, $690 million, I think $690 million in revenue across the last year, and something like $9.6 billion in revenue growth, 690% growth in jobs across the industry. So those are not numbers that are difficult to look away from, particularly in areas of New Jersey, as our friend said in the back, where job growth is an issue as well. So that's a piece of the pie here that we have struggled to better understand since taking our position. And so I just wanted to throw that to the bishop and also to others on the panel who might want to talk about the economics of it all.
Yeah, I mean, James, you've done a lot of research and a lot of reporting into the idea that maybe New Jersey is like sort of has untapped potential here. I mean, give me an idea of what we might look at if legalization were to happen.
Well, the estimates are all over the board, but people on the pro-legalization side have said this could be $1 billion industry in New Jersey. And in fact, in the governor's budget document for his original budget, marijuana was not included in the final budget, but they were estimating as much as $300 million a year ultimately in tax revenue from marijuana, which is not a huge amount, but it's certainly something. That budget document assumed a 25% excise tax on marijuana. The current numbers that have been thrown out are a lot lower. It's as low as 10%. That's one of the major issues that's holding up this legislation. But if you want to talk about the private sector impact, the numbers I've heard are in the billion-dollar range. Now, that said, in California, Colorado, Washington State, these grandiose numbers have been thrown out and to some extent have materialized, to some extent haven't. And New Jersey would be the first state in its immediate vicinity, in all likelihood, to have a marijuana market. But think about what happens when New York gets in the game, because New York is, in all likelihood, going to get in the game. So New Jersey loses that de facto regional monopoly. New Yorkers will not be getting on the train to buy marijuana, here in New Jersey once that happens. So the market, it's a lot like casinos. Atlantic City had a de facto monopoly on gambling in the Northeast for a long time. That hasn't been the case, for years now. Pretty much the same with marijuana. So, we could have a very short-term sort of sugar high of economic impact, and it could dissipate rather quickly once these other states get in the game.
Yeah, the thing the analogy I always use, it's almost like a pharmaceutical company, and that's a terrible analogy, but you have a new pharmaceutical drug on the market, you got 7 years, so everybody makes all their money, and then it becomes, the patent expires, everybody else goes. But that's where New Jersey is, because if New Jersey legalizes tomorrow, you're the only state between, Massachusetts is the next one. There's real opportunity there. I want to take a question here from Val, who came out tonight. Val, what's your question for the panel?
So my question is for the panel. With the opioid epidemic that we have, across Monmouth, Ocean, Atlantic, everywhere in New Jersey, pretty much, why wouldn't you be opposed to a more natural rehabilitative state with, recovering addicts, and make sure that they are educated and that they don't have to go to the streets for those drugs? So the different strains for the different, what the gentleman in the back was talking about with what he struggles with on the medical side, recreationally, I think the education is still that much more important because, yes, I went through the DARE program when I was in, elementary school and so on, but to be honest, opioid epidemic is you trust your doctor. Whereas, with the streets, everyone's bad. But, I'm a medical marijuana patient. Recreationally, I would like to see more just because of the educational piece. I've only been in the program less than 6 months, but I have learned so much more, and I am so much more confident in the way I can treat myself than, anything else. I'd much rather, stay at home and enjoy recreationally than go out to a bar and possibly get a DUI. So.
That's always an interesting comparison here. Nick Butcher, I want to throw it to you. What was your experience like? Marijuana's always been there, but these new drugs there's been a drug of choice every decade. Right now, the opioid crisis, as far as I'm concerned, we can't talk about it enough. What are you hearing from what Val's saying? Is marijuana a way to start curbing that?
That's our start. I look at the overall picture with drugs in general and the prohibited drugs today down through the schedules, from Schedule 1, which is a prohibited drug, and marijuana happens to be in that schedule. It's prohibited. You can't possess it, you can't on a federal level, and on a state level right now, it's still a Schedule 1 drug. It's right next to heroin, which is a Schedule 1 drug. It's a prohibited drug. So when we hear heroin, we go, ooh, that's bad. But let me tell you something. There's a drug out there that's a Schedule 2 drug that's 50 times stronger than heroin. 50 times. It's fentanyl. And fentanyl, you can purchase it on the internet, on the dark internet. You can purchase it and mail it right to your house. And the dealers go out there and they sell it on the street as heroin. And that's adding to all the overdoses we're having in this state.
Thanks so much, Nick. I want to take a question here from Frank. Frank's had his hand up for the last 20 minutes or so. So Frank, what do you have to say for the panel?
Sure. So my name's Frank Beatrice. I'm a representative and one of the co-founders of CannaGather New Jersey. We are the only Canna business networking association in the state. We work with advocates and with local government to make sure that the cannabis industry is established safely. Just quick introduction, just before I was opposed to marijuana growing up. It was only after my life was in danger and I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease that I support it. So My organization has received, we also operate in Manhattan, from the Manhattan DA and his seal of approval on growing cannabis entrepreneurs. I also work with minorities for medical marijuana in the state of New Jersey, and I just wanted to quell some things that came up. Jethro, at the beginning of the discussion, you mentioned there being no EpiPen for THC. CBD is actually a naturally occurring compound that is the cure for THC. It relieves the high, and that's what doctors are using more and more in different states.
Not for babies. Not for babies.
But it can be used.
But not for babies. That's like saying you're going to give a baby a Sudafed. Babies can't take Sudafed, and I preface my remarks by saying 0 to 8, so not for babies. And there is no EpiPen for the babies, and so I did talk about the age bracket. And again, we're not against the medical piece, and everyone here pretty much has talked about the medical piece. What we are against is the wholesale recreation piece, because that's what's going to destroy us. And I need to say this, and I know I'm correct. I remember the brothers coming back from Vietnam. I was in college. We nodded out on the streets of Newark, Patterson, Camden, Trenton. Nobody cared. It was only when the opioids got on the Parkway and decided to come to towns where we weren't predominantly the people. There was no opioid crisis until it hit the yards and backyards, like there was no AIDS crisis until they hit folk that didn't look like us. And that's the reality. And so medical, I think you ought to have medical marijuana. I'm a cancer survivor, real proud of it, cancer-free today, thank God. Contracted on 9/11 at Ground Zero. But the reality is, if you turn it loose, and I heard my brother officer, retired officer over there, talked about what he has seen with fentanyl. The reality is that fentanyl, and they will keep producing what we call P-dope, pharmaceutical dope, stuff out in the street. Right now, there is no regulation, even proposed in the bill, and I think my colleague in the ACLU will tell you this, on even how to control how much THC is being produced. They have some stuff that is 90%. They don't want you to touch it, but they want you to smoke it. How much money is it going to cost the government, and that's what we're seeing in some of the states, to take care of those that are now born mentally disabled? Because every parent and every grandparent ought to worry about this. They're selling not medical marijuana, but marijuana, and telling women, and it will help your first trimester in your pregnancy. However, they don't want you to drink, they don't want you to smoke cigarette, can't have a glass of wine, but take some THC, put it in your baby's brain, and guess what? It'll be in your breast milk. So when you feed the baby, how much money, and I've asked this, I chair the Human Service Advisory Council of Essex County, 22 municipalities. I've asked Dr. Scarpelli, how much money does it cost to raise a child that is born with a mental disability to the age of 25? And so the money is going to go in other social programs, or you're going to have a whole bunch of children that are going through what we went through before with the crack crisis.
So we have another medical marijuana question here. I think it's I mean, we get a lot of medical questions, and I think that just kind of shows that there's a lot of talk about expanding the medical marijuana program. So this is questions from Lori. Lori, yeah, stand up.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to say that I was diagnosed with breast cancer a few months ago, and I'm 64 years old, and I was given anti-cancer drugs, and I nearly died. And then I found sureorganics.com, Brandon, on the internet, and I know nothing about marijuana, I don't know, cannabis, sorry. And he is so patient with me. Fast forward, I guess my surgery was when? June? June, I had surgery. God willing, I'm cancer-free, and
Congratulations.
thank you. And oh no, it's I'm not any different than anybody else. I'm not a survivor. I didn't battle cancer. It's just that I'm a runner, and all I wanted to do was run. And I asked the doctor, when can I go back to running? She goes, well, do you want to find out if you have cancer still? So anyway, because of Brandon, he's working with me so patiently on the medical strains, and all I want to do is get a good night's sleep. And I have to say, I'm back running 5 days a week, 18 miles a week, and working. So thank you. Thank you, Brandon, and God bless everybody.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Lori. Amal, I cut you off. I didn't see you. I have the camera right in front of me, and then I just looked and happened to see you about to talk. So what were you about to say? I apologize.
No, it's okay. So, Lori, congratulations on being cancer-free. That's really remarkable and an inspirational story. One of the things that I wanted to touch on was relating to the economic benefits. We talked about some of the industry perspective economic benefits, but we should talk about the ancillary industries that are going to be impacted by marijuana legalization. We're in New Jersey. We're in the middle of a research and development hub. There are universities all around us. There are very smart people all around us with PhDs and other degrees that are going to be doing research. It's incredibly important for cannabis to be scheduled from the federal level and the state level so that we can conduct the right sorts of research. Right now, it's prohibited at the federal level. So we can conduct the right sorts of research into cannabis to figure out what the right quantities of THC are, to figure out what the regulations should be, figure out who deserves what strain, and do that work that needs to happen. And that's a multi-million-dollar industry in itself, the research and development arm. There's also HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning. That's a unique need for cannabis dispensaries and cannabis grow facilities that's going to see an economic boon. So there's going to be skilled HVAC professionals that are going to need to be employed by cannabis facilities or contracted with cannabis facilities. There's unique lighting needs for cannabis grow facilities, which is something that's going to come up as well. There's engineering needs and agriculture needs and transportation and trucking and all of that. So these are all industries that are going to see a benefit economically from legalization. And it's something that we should all be invested in.
Yeah, James, you've written a number of stories about these. I mean, this is like a niche industry, these sort of cannabis-adjacent businesses.
Yeah, there's a point I was going to make, too, in reference to the people who are talking about medical marijuana. Right now in New Jersey, there are about 34,000 people with medical cards. The numbers are not yet definitive in terms of recreational users in states that have legalized because it's only been a few years. But it's been shown that as many as 10% of adults in some of these states that have legalization are at least occasional users. So in New Jersey, we're talking about the potential from going from 34,000 legal users into potentially hundreds of thousands. So that has big implications, both in terms of economic impacts, which Amal referred to, and also just society. You know, how many people are going to be using and what's going to be the effect. Governor Jerry Brown of California was a skeptic of legalization, and one of the reasons he gave was, well, all these people are going to be stoned, and what's that going to mean to our economic recovery? You know, when you have people showing up for work essentially impaired. But California, Colorado, and Washington State all have among the strongest economies in the country right now. It's not necessarily attributable to marijuana, but it's also not necessarily unattributable in terms of, you know, the downside effect. So really, there's not a lot of evidence either way that having legal marijuana is going to make a big difference in your state's economy. As Amal points out, there are a lot of businesses that revolve around marijuana. When I was in California reporting on some of this in the spring, I found everything from apps that help you find the strain of cannabis and the method of ingestion. There's a lot of marketing and social media. You know, it's a big industry. And when you remove all the barriers, you do get a lot of these ancillary businesses that sprout up. But, you know, it's an open question how many of them will survive. It's a very young industry. And like every young industry, you know, there's a lot of creative destruction. A lot of this stuff is going to go out of business. At some point, when the federal ban is lifted, as Amal referred to, if that happens, we're talking about a huge amount of consolidation here, and a lot of the mom and pops might be out of the game, and you might be getting the InBevs, Anheuser-Busch, you know, the big cigarette companies, even Coca-Cola has kind of sniffed around the marijuana space a little bit. So you could be going from a lot of mom and pops to a huge industry.
And that's why it's incredibly important for New Jersey to set up the infrastructure right now so that those smaller businesses can succeed. So that if in the future we do have a moment where there is a national trend towards legalization and there is a federal there's a federal cure to prohibition, then we're going to have people in this state that are ready, willing, and able to participate in that broader market.
All right, we're gonna take a question from our new friend Joanne. Joanne, how you doing?
Hi, good. How are you? I think what Brandon was trying to say was, how do we stop arrests right now for people that are using it for recovery? And home cultivation is safe, affordable access for patients. What can we do about that now for the people that need it when it's too overpriced for them to access?
Right now with the legislation that's going on, if you read the legislation, the pending legislation, by the time you get finished reading it, it changed. Because they're constantly rolling it over and changing, and this is why it's being stretched out. The state of New Jersey is not rushing into this. They're doing it by the legislation. They're not doing it by ballot. If we took a vote here tonight and said, we'll raise our hands, a majority of the people want to legalize marijuana, it's done, it's now legal. New Jersey's not doing that. They're saying, we're stepping back, we're going to do it through legislation. And I keep reading this thing. By the time I get finished, there's more changes. There's more changes. I said,
allow me to
the final
continue.
Product?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
All right, I'm sorry, Bishop, please.
The reason it was at my church, I took the governor on. I was part of his transition team. And I do agree with my colleague that it's study change and it's evolving, but it's evolving because of folks like myself and those on this panel that are saying, what about this and what about that? The problem that I have, why are we trying to push something through without the answers to the questions? And the devil is always in the details. Again, I have no problem with medical because I believe those that legitimately need it should have it. The reality is when we look at some of the states that have it, you can say, guess what, my toe hurts, and you can get a card. And that is one of the abuses that's going on. The other piece of it is that even in Colorado, we have seen a black market. And the other piece, it's all cash. It's all cash. And I'm going to take Newark because I know Newark well. If this young lady pulls up to a site inside urban areas, I'm going to get a car, her pocketbook, and maybe hurt her also. And so even in the crime statistics, and we're seeing that in some of the states, but in the urban areas. And so where this legalization piece is going, that the state is looking at, again, 60 municipalities, and he mentioned that means 420. The only reason they haven't said anything yet is because nobody is trying to bring it in their backyard, but everybody in the urban, and the cities you mentioned, let's talk about Jersey City, let's talk about Newark, and in the legislation, by the way, Asbury Park, the legislation, the way it's written as of now, you get 3% of your municipality sales. And so let's say Newark sells $5 million worth of marijuana. The code enforcement is on the city. $5 million would bring you only $150,000. You can't even hire reps for that.
Amal?
So I wanted to talk about the arrest issue that you brought up. There are, as Nick mentioned, there are over 25,000 arrests that we're making every year for marijuana possession. And those are largely of black and brown men in the state. Newark is the city with the most marijuana possession arrests in the state, which makes sense because it's the biggest city, but even it's disproportionately more in Newark. However, the head of the police division, of the public safety division in Newark, Anthony Ambrose, he says that he doesn't want his officers wasting time with marijuana possession arrest. There's a whole bunch of other priorities that he would rather have his officers focusing on, and he would love to give them guidance that says, we're no longer going to do this. And I would encourage law enforcement to think creatively about what they can do to deprioritize these low-level arrests, which are just wreaking havoc on individuals' lives. We had a good piece of guidance from the Attorney General's office recently talking about how municipal prosecutors should consider those collateral consequences when they're thinking about amending or dismissing charges. I think that's a great step forward. They're thinking about educational consequences, the economic consequences, the familial consequences, the immigration consequences, and they are reducing charges across the state. And we want to see that happen uniformly across the state. But I think it's also imperative that law enforcement cut off the process at the knees, right? Make sure that we are not unnecessarily arresting people over and over and over again in Newark and Jersey City and Camden and places where we know these arrests are happening with some degree of saturation. It's really, really important that law enforcement takes steps to reform itself in anticipation of legalization. Otherwise, we're going to have a bunch of officers who are really committed to doing marijuana enforcement on a daily basis with very little to do in the aftermath.
Chief, Nick, please.
The Asbury Park Press did an investigation on the municipal courts in this state, and I followed that. I live in a little borough called Seaside Park Borough, very small town. We have one of the highest marijuana arrest rates in the state, this little borough. And it's all about the money, because each and every time someone is arrested in that borough, they have to go to municipal court. They get a nice stiff fine and they're sent on their way. And sometimes the charges are downgraded. We have an ordinance in this town that you can't smoke on the boardwalk, a regular cigarette. They have undercover cops up on the boardwalk looking for young people smoking a cigarette. They walk up to them, license, registration, or however they approach them, identification, empty your pockets. And if they find a bag of marijuana, they get arrested for possession.
Chief Zabrowski, like I said before, I mean, I think Sayreville is kind of, it's a good microcosm of a lot of the state. I mean, when we talk about doing things differently on a local level, I mean, can you see that playing out? I mean, I wonder what your take on that would be as somebody in charge of this.
I mean, I've had a conversation with Director Ambrose, and I'm all for making my job and my officer's job easy as well. I think we want to be more efficient and more effective. And the point is that let's not treat the symptom if we're treating it with the issue is a bigger one than that. And I think maybe that's what the case is. We've already addressed bail issues, right? We now have bail reform, and I brought that up earlier. There is no reason why we can't take steps to make the process more simple, more efficient, and also more fair for those that are involved within that system. I think if we sit down and we put all our collective minds together, including and working with the Attorney General and everyone else that has a say in this or should have a say in this, I think we can accomplish this. But it's not the issue, I don't believe it's the issue of legalizing marijuana. I don't think it changes the issues that Amal's talking about. And that concerns me, because then what is the next issue after that? We're addressing in many, many ways. And listen, I respect Nick. He did a wonderful job in the state police, but how long have you been retired now? 26 years. I can tell you, as being in law enforcement and still being in law enforcement, we have made extreme strides with issues of accreditation, with training, with everything to do with working with Amal's group and working with Reverend James's group to try to make the way we go about our business more professional. I don't think it's the issue of legalization of marijuana. I would love to sit down on a larger panel and be able to discuss all the issues and how to make the criminal justice system better. But I don't believe it's the issue of legalization of recreational marijuana that's going to do it.
All right, I want to throw it now to my colleague from the Bergen Record. Never a dull moment, right? John?
Thanks, Mike. At the State House Bureau, I just want to fill in a couple of things that people are talking about. We mentioned legislation. As it stands now, there is no actual bill that leadership says this is the thing that we're going to vote on, this is what's going to happen. There's frameworks, there's draft bills, there's things floating around. And these deadlines from the Senate President Steve Sweeney have been voluntary. There's no real push other than he says, I hope to get it done by the end of September. I hope to get it done by the end of October. There's no real commitment on the Assembly side to get anything done. And now there's a real back and forth between the Senate President and the Assembly and the Governor. So it's unclear if anything will get done this year or what, or when. And as it stands now, there's still a lot to be discussed and negotiated. What I'd like to know is what some of your constituencies, what are you doing now in this lull? What's happening now? What kind of lobbying efforts do you anticipate? And what specifics do you think you can chip away at between what's being talked about in the draft versions and what you hope to get done?
Well, I'm in Trenton on a regular basis, talking to the legislators from the president of the Senate to Coughlin, the person who's the Speaker of the Assembly. And we're talking even with some of the policy folks and saying, these are the things we need to look at. I was sitting at the table with one of the representatives from the governor's office, and we got to talking about code enforcement. As I said, I believe decrim is the way to go. And when I talked about the code enforcement piece, I said most municipalities can't stop our youth from buying loosies. Now, these were the people that were going to write pieces of the legislation, and they said, Bishop, what's a loosie? And so if you don't have any idea what a loosie is, how are you going to stop our children? And loosies, by the way, if anybody out there doesn't know, is loose cigarettes. How are you going to stop them from going to that same bodega and buying a marijuana candy bar or marijuana lace? And the reality, that's what they're seeing in Washington, D.C. They're seeing the food trucks. Nobody is doing the code enforcement piece. And so there's so much that has to be done. And so I talk to the legislators on a weekly basis and the governor's people when they'll take my call, because sometimes they look at me and say, oh God, here he comes again. But I believe those that need it medically, you should have that right. Decriminalization, where you don't have to arrest everybody, and the argument was how many grams, you know, is it 35 as they have in New York? And in New York, just recently I was at Hot 97 and did a piece over there, and their people said, well, folks are still going to jail. I said, why? They said, well, you get a ticket for smoking it in public or in the wrong place, and the ticket is $125, and you forget to go to court. If you get a traffic ticket and you don't go to court, in this state, they issue a warrant. And if you get stopped, you go to jail. And so a lot of it, the devil is in the details, and I really don't think they thought this thing through. So what's the rush? Let the medical folks have the medical, and let's have a real conversation with law enforcement and everybody else at the table on decriminalization. Because after all, how much marijuana do you need? Oh, 5 pounds, is that enough? Or if you're caught with a joint and whatever. But here's the other piece that we need to look at. If you live in federal housing, because remember, this is only state law. If you live in federal housing, that's senior citizens buildings. If you get what they call TRA, temporary rental assistance, for those that are receiving assistance, welfare, if you are caught smoking, you will be sanctioned on welfare for 6 months. And if you live in senior housing, because it's against federal law, you are automatically evicted. We had that conversation with the head of Essex County Legal Services just a week ago.
You know, the bishop mentioned something interesting before, too. Edibles. I mean, that's, I know from when we did our High Hopes project, which if you haven't read it, APP.com/highhopes, we have a number of great articles and videos and a bunch about it. I know I was in Colorado, and edibles in Colorado are neck and neck with traditional smoked marijuana, and that's largely because I think it's a way for people that didn't have smoking experience to get into it. I want to throw it to James because, James Nash, you had one of the coolest experiences journalistically when you were in California. Talk to me about your running around with the Bureau of Cannabis Control, about
Sure.
hitting these dispensaries.
Well, a couple things to mention about edibles. Actually, it goes back to a point that Nick made a little while ago about finding a joint in the car. Now you're probably more likely to find an empty bag of, cannabis, infused chewables and that kind of thing. And you can perhaps smell the marijuana if your nose is right there on the plastic. But if you're a police officer and the window is rolled down in the car, you're not going to know that there's marijuana in there. You're not going to see a cloud of smoke. So that is another thing that complicates things from the law enforcement perspective when you have so many people now doing the edible products. And by the way, they're not just edibles anymore, they're also drinkables. There's something called Cannabis Cooler that you can find in the stores in California. You're not allowed to mix alcohol and marijuana, so if you prefer those two things, you have to take them separately. There is no cannabis-infused beer in California, but there are drinks now, there are jelly bean type things. You cannot legally market to children, so what Bishop James was referring to earlier with respect to ice cream and that kind of thing, I didn't see any ice cream. I didn't see anything that was explicitly kid-style candy. That said, though, with the Bureau of Cannabis Control, that was one of the things that they were on the lookout for, because prior to legalization, there were a lot of these products illegally moving around that arguably were more geared toward children. Like, for example, I saw some animal crackers that had marijuana in them. That was a product that the Bureau of Cannabis Control said, no way, we're not allowing that. So that is one aspect of a regulated market. You can actually go into the stores and inspect, and you can take these products off the shelves, but it's a constant sort of whack-a-mole game because you have new products coming onto the market at any given time. And at least when I was there several months ago, there were only like 30-odd officials in the Bureau of Cannabis Control doing these inspections in a state of 40 million people. So, that'll probably be the case here if and when New Jersey gets to legalization. You'll have a regulated market that's sort of still the Wild West until the regulators catch up. And I know the state is trying to avoid that scenario, but, it is a gold rush and people will jump into the business if you let them.
All right, we're going to take one more question here from DK. DK.
Hello, how you guys doing? Thank you for coming out tonight and talking about this, sharing this information with all these wonderful people around us. My question for you guys is, what's the difference between medical marijuana and recreational use? You're doing the same thing. Some people are claiming that, it's a medical benefit. What about the other people that are missing out on that? You have to go through a whole process of finding a doctor. I believe you have to go to them for a certain amount of time before they can diagnose you with this. Secondly, about the opioids, it's just terrible. It's terrible. Like Bishop was saying earlier, the gentlemen that were coming back from the Vietnam War, they were using that stuff, and America did not seem to care. We're caring so much now because it's not only the black community that it's affecting all of us. Then with decriminalization versus, medical marijuana, what are we going to do with people that's using it recreationally? They're still going to be getting arrested. So what's the solution here?
Interesting points. Yeah, Bishop James, please.
If I may, that's why I said decrim. And Senator Rice just recently has asked for a racial disparity on what it would be for full legalization versus decriminalization. Decrim says, and I'll just use 35 grams of marijuana, that if you're caught with 35 grams of marijuana, it's yours, you're welcome, take it, go to the place designated and smoke it. No problem. Hopefully, depending on your tolerance, you don't get behind the wheel of an automobile, grab Uber or a good friend to take you home. That's what we're talking about. So it doesn't impact someone that just wants to do it recreationally. And all we're saying to the state is, why move to full legalization when fine, you already have the medical piece. It's legal in this state. And let me say this, even in the application for the medical piece, my folks are noticeably not at the table. It's a 10-page application, $20,000 to put in the application. You get 50 points if you are a minority. you still have to talk about you have a MOU, a memo of understanding for your security company, a memo of understanding for your insurance company, a memo of understanding for the place that you're going to get it from, and there's a whole bunch of things. Folks, many people of color just don't have access to that money. You can't go to the bank and get it unless you're bankrolled by one of these larger companies, which really makes you a front to put you in the business. And so we're not in that business in this state. Those 6 new applications that did go forth were not meant for us. And the inside, and I'm an insider to a degree, in Trenton, the reality was those folks were picked prior to even the applications going out. And one other thing that you mentioned earlier, and this was brought out at a recent town hall meeting in Newark and the ACLU, there, a gentleman from Africa was there. He had been in Newark since 1997, but he was not a citizen. He and his attorney came, so there was no conflict of attorney-client privilege. And he got up and said, because I got caught, and this is what it's so important to decriminalize, with a bag of marijuana, and I'm not a U.S. citizen, under this administration in Washington, they're going to deport this brother for a small bag of marijuana. And so decriminalization, I believe, would solve a lot of problems, continue to develop out the medical piece for those that need it. But God forbid, if you turn full legalization loose, you're turning loose a hungry dog with a pack of children, and they eat kids.
As we start to wind up here.
Yeah. So a couple of things, and I want to raise 2 points. One in which I'm in agreement with the bishop, and one in which I'm in disagreement with the bishop. Agreement is that this is a message to folks that are involved in the industry. So when the governor expanded medical marijuana licenses over the summer, and then all of a sudden there was 6 more licenses available. There was a portion of there in the application about community involvement and diversity and all of that. I can't tell you the number of calls my organization got to be a reference for industry folks that were trying to get involved in the medical industry, and we refuse. We're not playing that role. And it's because, let me tell you this, there was radio silence before and radio silence after. So it's really important for us to push back on this whole process and say, look, you can't just be committed to superficial diversity. You can't just be committed to superficial community involvement. It's got to be real, it's got to be rooted, and there's got to be people from communities that are directly impacted, that are serving in the industry as leaders. Secondly, on the place where I think we disagree a little bit is on decriminalization. If that individual that had the immigration consequence was caught with marijuana in a decriminalized state, he would still be given a civil penalty. If that person didn't pay that civil penalty, they would still be subject to arrest. And that's still really, really problematic for a lot of people. And it creates this legal fiction, right, where you're allowed to possess marijuana, but you can't grow it, you can't buy it, you can't sell it. How do you come into contact with it? You're basically saying that we're going to turn a blind eye and not enforce the laws and say, yeah, go ahead, get it from the illegal market. We're just going to be okay with that. Or we're so naive that we think that it's somehow going to eradicate marijuana possession. I think neither of those options is a good one. So that's why I think decriminalization is a bad choice, and legalization is the only way.
I want to thank our panel so much for being here. Please give them a round of applause. They volunteered their time to be here. There are many events like this throughout the state. We wanted to keep this free. We wanted to have this conversation. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our friends at the Asbury Hotel for having us. Please keep talking about marijuana with yourselves, with us. We'll be around. Thank you so much for coming out tonight.